If it wasn't obvious from the title, Mad as a Hatter introduced its viewers to yet another member of Batman's Rogues Gallery, Mad Hatter. I appreciate that Batman the Animated Series only used 2 parts to tell a villain's origin when their backstory really needed it to flesh out their motivations for turning to crime. The Mad Hatter's origin is simple, but there's still plenty of psychology into the formation of a supervillain persona. Meet Jervis Tetch, a scientist at Wayne Enterprises who develops microchips that give him the ability of mind control. At the beginning of the episode, he's very shy and nervous, only acting normal when he's by himself, controlling mice to make his own tea party. Beginning the episode this way is a good way to foreshadow over the edge Jervis will go later on. His boss, Dr. Cates, is constantly breathing down his neck, especially when Bruce Wayne comes to visit, and he's infatuated with his secretary Alice, most likely because of his obsession with the book Alice in Wonderland. This episode was written by Paul Dini, and while not his most stellar script within Batman the Animated Series, it's a good sign that we know as much about Tetch as we do in a pretty short amount of time. There are very clever parallels and elements that come from Alice in Wonderland that I'll expand on more as we go along. One thing that I kind of question is that despite having built a really cool mind control apparatus, is that when Bruce Wayne visits to check on Jervis's project, he says the prototype isn't ready yet. My only guess is that he lied because he thought Bruce Wayne would disapprove of mind control like he did to Edward Nygma in Batman Forever, but then what would he show Bruce Wayne if he didn't resort to crime later on in the episode? Anyway, Jervis realizes that Alice got into a fight with her boyfriend, but what adds sophistication to Jervis's character is that at first he decides to do nothing. He's insecure about himself and doesn't think that such a beautiful girl would want to go out with him. This is another case of Batman the Animated Series portraying something in a realistic manner, especially with Jervis's mannerisms and when he decides not to speak. However, in the same scene he decides to do nothing, he gets the brilliant but terrible idea of using his microchips to amass enough to impress Alice. Despite having his name on the title of the show, it surprises me how often Batman the Animated Series is willing to put Batman in the background and focus on other characters, which is especially true in Mad as a Hatter. Putting the focus on Mad Hatter is not meant for the audience to root for him, but for the audience to find it believable that a person would do something as extreme and out there as becoming a supervillain. Jervis's motivations begin as simply finding a girl, but the fact that he can control people's minds gives him a taste of power, which corrupts him and allows Jervis to go over the edge. Batman Arkham Asylum by Grant Morrison was one of the first places I believe where Mad Hatter was made to be a pedophile. With a Batman cartoon, they obviously couldn't do something that dark and psychologically twisted, but what's done here is still quite dark, especially at the end. So on his date with Alice, Jervis mind controls people wherever they go so the date can be as fancy as possible. Batman finally gets involved when Jervis has 2 muggers jump into the river. When Batman saves and apprehends the muggers, he's able to examine the microchip technology. The writing of this episode avoided a trap of convenience when Batman connects the microchip to Jervis. Instead of Batman examining the tech and thinking, hey, I'm gonna go after this guy I saw earlier today, even though there are probably many other scientists in Gotham that can do this, like that guy that invented that silly thing called Hardak. He's able to connect it precisely to Jervis because of the Alice in Wonderland poster in his office that Alfred points out. One of the first really interesting bits of imagery, and there's plenty of it this episode, is during the date when Jervis dances with Alice in the Wonderland section of Gotham's Storybook Land after quoting the Mock Turtle song. With how gothic and otherworldly Gotham City can be, I buy that something that I don't see much in cities like a park based on Alice in Wonderland actually exists here. Immediately after their date, Alice and her boyfriend make up and get engaged, putting Jervis strictly into the friend zone, which drives him over the edge. It's actually gut-wrenching as we see Jervis truly lose it when he crushes the roses he got for Alice as she tells him about the engagement. Having gone over the edge, he decides to use his mind-control chips to get whatever he wants, specifically getting Alice to love him and turning anyone who gets in his way into a mindless puppet. One of my favorite moments in the episode is after Jervis goes over the edge and his boss comes into his office to chastise him because Bruce Wayne's back. Jervis puts one of his mind control cards on her and says, "Oh, do be quiet, Dr. Cates." At this point, Jervis has gone full on supervillain, so I'm just going to call him Mad Hatter. So he mind controls Alice's fiancé to breaking up with her, but in his insane eagerness to have Alice, he goes too far at decorating her house with flowers and trying to romance her when she hadn't told anyone that her fiancé quote-unquote broke up with her. However, any hopes of Mad Hatter getting Alice to willingly love him are dashed when Batman shows up. At this point, he's lost even more humanity, because at the beginning, even before Alice got into a fight with her boyfriend, Jervis considers using his microchips on Alice, but decides not to because it would make her a soulless shell. Now that he's very desperate and corrupted by power, Mad Hatter makes the terrible choice that he'd rather have Alice as a doll than not have her at all. The most depressing thing about this character evolution is that in the end, Jervis brought this on himself and pretty much allowed himself to become evil. This type of story has been done many times, where the shy, repressed person finally cuts loose, which leads to either great or terrible results. The infamous Catwoman movie did something similar with its story, for example. Even though this is pretty typical, Mad as a Hatter handles this character progression in a way that makes sense, and is efficient, especially with the fact that there's only so much a character can be developed in 20 minutes, for the most part at least. This leads to the final battle between Batman and Mad Hatter's minions, dressed as characters from Alice in Wonderland. I really like that Mad Hatter dressed up Dr. Cates as the Queen of Hearts, complete with shouting at Batman, "Off with his head!" The episode uses this section to subtly comment on the nature of Batman's theatricality. While Storybook Land looks very wacky, it's odd that Batman doesn't look out of place inside it. Everything about this episode goes out of its way to integrate elements of Alice in Wonderland, both visual and literary, into Batman's world in a way that feels natural for both Mad Hatter and Batman. While Paul Dini didn't put focus on Batman's psychology, it's clear that he understands an idea that was also in the Arkham Asylum comic, that it takes a certain amount of crazy to decide to become Batman, and that's why Batman meshes so well with the world of Alice in Wonderland. The fight leads to a card labyrinth where Batman finally takes down the Mad Hatter by appropriately dropping a statue of the Jabberwocky on him. Even so, that is not the biggest defeat to Mad Hatter by the end, because Alice's fiancé frees her, and she looks at Mad Hatter with a look of disgust that is so heartbreaking that it expressed more than words ever could. And who wouldn't look at the Mad Hatter that way, absolutely pathetic and defeated on the floor after the despicable things he did? The episode ends with another appropriate reference to Alice in Wonderland, where the Mad Hatter once again quotes the Mock Turtle song. Could not, would not. Could not, would not. Oh, could not join the dance. The Mad Hatter is voiced by Roddy McDowall, who made the final quote sound so poignant and tragic. As for his performance on the whole, he was perfect casting for a role that required as much range as it did. In this episode, the character goes through such an evolution and a wide array of emotions. From his vocal performance, it's clear that Roddy McDowall was a very talented actor, who passed away in 1998, very soon before Mad Hatter's final appearance in the DC Animated Universe, in the Superman animated series episode Nighttime. The thing about his performance that impressed me most was how he was able to sell the over-the-top moments, and how he delivered the Alice in Wonderland quotes as if he memorized them like Mad Hatter would. Many different things have been done with Mad Hatter since this episode, like with Scarecrow, so it's not to say that I think Roddy McDowall would be ideal for voicing the completely psycho, pedophile version of the character that has become more prominent recently. Peter McNichol did a great job voicing this version of the character in Arkham City, by the way. Alice is voiced by Kimmy Robertson, who did a good job, but not stellar. There are several scenes where she cries because of her relationship status, and her crying was annoying, which might have been intentional but annoyed me anyway. Still, she did deliver the humorous lines really well, like when Batman shows up and she says, "Oh, this is getting too weird." The series regulars do a good job as well, but Mad Hatter takes up the majority of the acting in this episode. The animation overall is bad, to be honest, but there has been worse animation in past episodes. I'd say it looks much like the first part of Feet of Clay. There are parts where both Batman and Mad Hatter look oddly deformed. Probably the worst case for Batman is when he tries to keep the two thugs from jumping off the bridge. For the Mad Hatter, I'd say it's when Alice walks into her house and finds all the flowers. When Mad Hatter pops out of a flower, she shrieks. I'd have done the same, judging from how freakishly deformed his face is, especially with his misshapen teeth. Besides the deformities, the animation and action sequences are passable, but it does extract energy from the episode. To be fair, the core energy of the episode comes from dialogue and psychology, but bad animation is never a plus, and good animation is always a plus, no matter how mediocre the story is. The music fares better than the animation for the most part. There's a certain wackiness to Mad Hatter's theme that fits the character that I think works better than in Joker's theme for the series. The scene where Jervis and Alice dance in Storybook Land reminded me a lot of the scene in Batman '89 where Vicky Vale dances with Joker on the bell tower, musically speaking. Wrapping things up, Mad as a Hatter is a well-done exploration of a new villain that is quite a downer for an action-adventure cartoon. Despite the poor animation, the episode gets the fundamental elements of the villain origin right in a relatively short amount of time, so I rate Mad as a Hatter a 4 out of 5. I probably would have enjoyed it less if the references to Alice in Wonderland weren't so well integrated. Thanks for joining me, and next time we move on to the final episode of the first box set, Dreams in Darkness. Pretty ominous, right? Well, such a title can only guarantee an awesome episode, so I hope you guys stay tuned for that review. Until then, take care.